If you're wanting to buy a GPU for under $300, you don't really have many options. Sure, you could go for an RTX 4060 from Nvidia, but if you're dead set on having an RDNA based AMD GPU, there really isn't much in the way of choice. AMD's latest RX 7600 came in at $269 after some last minute price dropping, but how does it stack up against something a little older, the trusty RX 6700, which is now sitting at the exact same price point? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So AMD's RDNA 3 based RX 7600 launched in May of this year, just over 2 years from the launch of the RX 6700 non-XT. Now, with naming does sometimes come some confusion, should we say. But to make it clear, the newer card, though is part of the 7000 series, is only a 600 class card, while the 6700 is a 6000 series, but is a 700 class card. And that's clear to see in the differences when looking at the specs. The RDNA 3 based GPU comes with 23% less transistors and a 39% smaller die. And with the biggest cut down being in the memory department, not only do we have 8GB of GDDR6 compared to 10GB, but the bus comes in much smaller at 128-bit compared to 160-bit on the 6700. And that also means less memory throughput, 10% to be exact, going from 322GB per second to just 288. And this creates some problems in the latest titles that are more demanding with VRAM than ever before. Now, in terms of core specs, the 7600 also comes in the lesser of the two, with 11% less shading units, texture mapping units, compute units, and RT cores, while the ROPs stay the same at 64 on both cards. Now, the other key area that changes is the 33% less L2 cache on the RX 7600 and 60% less L3 cache as well. All of this combined with the lackluster memory subsystem could spell a disaster for the latest GPU from Team Red, especially as both cards come in at the same $269 price point. So with that being said, it's time to put it to the test and to see how they both do. Now, we put the GPUs onto our graphics card benchmarking system with an Intel Core i9 12900K on an Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard paired with 32GB of Patriot Viper 6200MHz dual channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 and we tested 15 games plus 4 games in ray tracing in total. And due to where the GPUs are positioned in the market, we'll be putting our focus on 1080p and 1440p, as well as looking at the overall averages of both a little later on. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem on the Ultra preset, and straight away the RX 7600 does manage to push ahead by 3% at 1080p and 4% at 1440p, which is nothing to grumble at, but in terms of the generational uplift, doesn't exactly offer up anything too exciting, and honestly, I expected more. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, things start to get even worse for the latest RDNA 3 based GPU, as it now falls 11% behind the RX 6700 at 1080p and a staggering 20% behind at 1440p. The extra VRAM and much wider bus and bandwidth for the older GPU clearly makes a sizable difference, putting the RX 7600 in a pretty bad position. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the 7600 fights back and takes a 10% lead over the 6700 at 1080p and a smaller 7% lead at 1440p. The performance in this game shows some much better margins, but I feel this may be a bit of a fluke and other games will show much closer results. That's exactly the case in Control, where the older generation 6700 storms ahead, putting this 7600 a whopping 28% slower at 1080p, and it doesn't get any better for the RX 7600 at 1440p, where it sits an even slower 33% behind. For a GPU that demands the same price as the older 6700, I just don't see a justifiable reason to buy the 7600 over something older for the exact same money. When we turn ray tracing on in Control, things do line up ever so slightly better, now with the 7600 sitting a small margin of error 2% ahead of the 6700 at 1080p. But again, the lack of VRAM and memory interface slow things back down again, now sitting 6% slower at 1440p. Cyberpunk is a very memory intensive game, but the 7600 actually does very well, coming in 35% faster than the 6700 at 1080p and 10% faster at 1440p. This is the type of performance that gamers expect from a newer generational card, with some real uplift from gen to gen, and more of a reason to buy a newer card compared to something a little bit older. Again though, that lead is short-lived when we enable ray tracing, and the 7600 now falls 19% behind the 6700 at 1080p and a staggering 82% behind at 1440p, equating to just 5 frames per second from the RDNA 3 based GPU. This is somewhat laughable at this point, though it is worth noting that both GPUs came in with unplayable frame rates on the Ultra setting with ray tracing enabled, but in terms of scaling, the 7600 just fails pretty miserably. Death Stranding shows some pretty impressive figures at both 1080 and 1440p, though again does see the newer 7600 drop behind by 14% at the lower resolution and 12% at the higher resolution. Don't get me wrong, the figures are good on both cards, but the extra performance seen from the 6700 for the same price just makes more sense at this point. Another extremely memory intensive game is Doom Eternal, which again due to the memory constraints sees the 7600 fall behind by 24% at 1080p and 18% behind at 1440p. Again, impressive numbers all around and something you wouldn't be disappointed in when playing, but extra performance for the same cost is still a bit of a no-brainer with the 6700 over the 7600. Finally, we see a little more competition from the 7600 in Dying Light 2, sitting 10% ahead of the 6700 at 1080p, though that margin narrows to just under 2% at 1440p, a lead that could be put down as margin of error. I mean, again, it's good, don't get me wrong, but still not great for the latest card on the market when wanting to move up from an older generation. Remember, the 6700 is still being sold brand new, so it's not like we're buying a used GPU that has suddenly dropped in value on the second-hand market. F122 is another title that really lets the frame rates fly, and both cards come in with exceptional figures well in excess of 200 FPS, though the 7600 does manage to take a small 3% lead at 1080p, but when looking at 1440p it falls behind by 5%. Again, that pesky memory configuration is a real letdown and sees the 7600 suffer at the higher resolution. Far Cry 6 shows that the newer card is able to fight back again by a margin of 6% at 1080p and 5% at 1440p, which is nice to see, but you have to ask, if this is the newest GPU on the market from Team Red, is 6% really enough to make you go wow when comparing data against a card that was released over 2 years ago? There really isn't much to say about Hogwarts Legacy, as at 1080p both cards came in identically, though the older 6700 did manage to chalk up a win with 7% more performance in the 1% lows. While at 1440p the performance again was very similar, with a margin of error lead to the 6700, again with stronger performance in the lows. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, and the 7600 comes in 2% faster at 1080p, which is nice to see, but nothing of huge significance, while at 1440p it actually falls 1 frame per second behind. Again, considering the cards come in at the same price, I think it's pretty hard to justify the 7600 as being the better card, when in this game they're so evenly matched. Spider-Man is one of the newest titles we test, and again is quite intensive in terms of CPU, GPU and memory, and here the 7600 comes out 5% faster at 1080p and with better 1% low figures, while at the higher resolution it's let down by its VRAM and falls just behind the 6700 by a single frame per second. Then, enabling ray tracing, it falls behind by 2% at 1080p and a larger 12% at 1440p. This goes to show that the ray tracing performance just isn't up to scratch on the 7600, especially at the larger resolution where it just seems throttled in comparison to the RDNA 2 based GPU. Microsoft Flight Sim sees the 7600 take the lead by a margin of 12% at 1080p and a larger 18% at 1440p. The newer architecture clearly makes a difference and presents some pretty impressive numbers overall. Now, if only all games showed this type of lead, it would be very easy to recommend it if that was the case. Then lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, the 7600 does manage to push ahead by a small 2% at 1080p and a slightly larger 3% at 1440p, though with very similar 1% low figures across both resolutions. When we enable ray tracing, however, the 7600 drops quite significantly, now trailing behind the 6700 by 18% at 1080p and 13% at 1440p. Though both cards wouldn't give the best gaming experience at sub 40 FPS, even at the lower 1080p resolution anyway. So it was an interesting fight between the cards, because normally we'd be comparing cards that are similar in price, but not the exact same price point. Being different in value always gives us a pretty clear-cut choice when performance doesn't match up and one offers up better value for money. But with these cards coming in the exact same cost, it just makes things a little bit trickier. Though I think it is actually clear to see that the generational uplift just isn't there. And while I get that the 6700 is one step up in the pecking order compared to a 600 series card, you'd always like to think that the next generation would just offer up something a little more. And well, in all honesty, I think that's where I feel it fell a little bit short. I mean, don't get me wrong, in some cases, like Microsoft Flight Sim, the 7600 came into its own and fought back. But then on the flip side, in other titles like Control, it gets blown out the water by the older RDNA 2 card. It was also the case with ray tracing, where the extra RT cores on the 6700 made a big difference. Even if the 7600 technically has less, but arguably better RT cores. It just all seems to be good in a roundabout way, but not quite good enough. And that's clear to see when we look at the overall frame rate average across all the games we tested. It's here where the 7600 comes in 3% slower than the 6700 at 1080p and 7% slower at 1440p. Yes, while the 7600 is geared more towards 1080p than 1440p, you'd still expect the newer card to at least put up a bit of a fight and come out on top. But again, it just fails. Now, taking ray tracing results out of the overall averages, and it gets even worse. Now with the 7600 coming in 8% slower at 1080p and a pretty stark 12% at 1440p. Now, I'll be honest, I think this is why consumers are confused and angry about GPUs in 2023, because the latest and what AMD would class as the greatest GPU in this price segment is still being beaten by something from 2 years ago. It feels like there's, I don't know, no innovation anymore, and instead, just like Nvidia have done with the 4060 and the 4060 Ti, things have been cut down, and it's hard to see why. To try and push efficiency and energy savings? Nah. While I get that the cost of living, including electricity, is the highest it's ever been, it's not the biggest thing that consumers focus on, and instead, they just want pure, unadulterated speed and performance. And yeah, the 7600 just lacks here, and that's very plain to see. Now luckily, the 7600 didn't come in with its original price point of $299, as that would have been, well, even worse for Team Red, and instead they did decide to cut it to launch at $269. But with the likes of the RX 6700 coming in at the exact same price point, I can't recommend getting the newer GPU, even if it is more energy efficient. Now there is one saving grace for the 7600, but it's not really a big one, and that comes down to the 6700 being phased out, so it won't be around forever. That will obviously over time artificially inflate how good the 7600 is if you're after a new GPU around $269. But on the flip side, there's nothing stopping you buying used and, well, saving even more money and getting the extra performance for an even better cost. Now, when we look at the cost, it's clear to see that the 6700 does offer better value in terms of cost per frame, where at 1080p it comes in 9% cheaper overall, though the 2080 Ti with even more VRAM is still better in terms of value for money at under $2 a frame. But would mean obviously buying a used card, which I get not everyone is going to be keen on doing. Now it's a similar story at 1440p, though the margin does grow to the 6700 coming out 13% cheaper per frame, with again that 2080 Ti still offering up better value. But again, if your heart is set on having a brand new card, then yeah, 6700, it's a clear winner. Now there is, I guess, a silver lining to a degree, if you can call it that, and that is FSR with frame generation, which, while it doesn't exist right now, is something that is meant to be coming later this year. But since its original showcase, which consisted of a slide showing that, it was coming, AMD have been very quiet on the matter. Now, it wouldn't actually surprise me if it ends up being shelved to early next year. Maybe, I don't know, with an announcement at CES 2024, it kind of makes sense. And that could actually be enough to fight back and put extra frames back onto the card. Because even at its somewhat reasonable price point, it just doesn't come across as the most attractive option, especially as the 6700 comes out ahead, and you'd like to think as stock dwindles, that price could actually drop even further. Now there have been moments where I've seen the 6700 drop by around $10 or so from its current $269 price point, and that just feeds more into the argument of being even better value for money again, and hurting the potential sales of the latest RDNA 3 based GPU, which, as we all know, aren't exactly being sold in an abundance. Now, as I mentioned, the RDNA 3 GPU is the more efficient card, but I fear that's not a strong enough point for AMD to make over something else at the same price point. The same goes for ray tracing. Moving up from the 6000 series to the 7000, you'd expect ray tracing performance to improve. And while Nvidia's RTX 4060 has superior performance in that area for a little more money, it again puts this card on the back foot. Now, I think the only thing AMD can do to help boost sales of the RX 7600 is to drop its price. Again, the fact that they kind of thought that they could position it at $299 was frankly laughable, but at $269, while it is better, it's still not enough. And for it to be classed as a viable option, in my opinion, it definitely needs to go to about $229 or even a little bit lower. Otherwise, as the data already suggested, people will just skip this one and move on to something better in the future, while either holding on to their current GPU or buying something older but still better, like the RX 6700, or of course, buying used, like a 2080 Ti. We also have to remember that AMD are far from done with the 7000 series, and the 7700 and 7800 series are coming very soon. So make sure you're subscribed for that, because we have a lot of content coming on it in the very near future. For this one, yeah, that about wraps things up. A weird video, but I'd like to think it has a pretty obvious conclusion. Skip the 7600 unless you see it heavily discounted, and make a better decision with the likes of the 6700 instead. Or just hold on to whatever you have at the moment for a little bit longer. So there we have it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then check out our exclusive Patreon members club, where you get tons of behind the scenes content, monthly live streams, bi-weekly game nights where you'll have lots of laughs and fun, and much, much more. The link for that is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.